who's a professorial tutor and fellow at St Anne's College. She's very well equipped in her knowledge of Victorian literature in general, but has a special interest in the child, the mind of the child. And her book, her latest book, which was published in 2010, called The Mind of the Child, Mind of a Child, the child, the mind of the child. Should be available in Blackwell's if you feel inspired to have a look at that. So, without any further ado, we're going to be talking about education and Dombey and Son. And so I'll hand over to you. Welcome.
Dickens in the context of our own time. You've probably been aware of newspaper headlines, not quite so recently, but at least only 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of headlines talking about the fact that British school children were the most over-examined in the world, that endless exams every age, and this is why we got backlash and attempts to reduce the numbers of exams that our students took. In addition to that, there were also what were called epidemics of anxiety in our classrooms. And there were also surveys that talked about the fact that our children appeared to be the most unhappy in the developed world. Really, food for thought there. Why is this? What are we doing? And linked to that, even more gruesome, the rise in child suicide. Now, what interested me was the way in which all these discussions were taking place as if they hadn't taken place before. So what I want to do is to put that sort of concern in relationship to Dickens in the 19th century. So I'm focusing, as you know, on Dombey and Son, published in 1848, the year of revolutions across Europe, hungry 40s, coming of railways, a real tumultuous time. But I'll give the novel its full title, very rarely emblazoned on front pages, but it's actually called Dealings with the Firm of Dombey and Son, Wholesale, Retail and for Exportation. So clearly you can see that what Dickens is doing is putting right up front the notion of mercantile capitalism. But it's also a novel about the dealings of a domineering father, with Dombey and Son embedded there in the middle of the title. So it's a domineering father with his children. But this strand is interwoven with an analysis of a society where, as Dickens put it, it was natural to be unnatural. So Dombey himself is a merchant, an absolute product of imperial capitalism, sending his goods all over the world and judging things only in terms of money. Dickens also foregrounds in this novel the coming of the railways. It was a time when England was being torn up, railways were being placed right across the country, transforming the way people thought about their lives and the ways in which they could move around and think about time and space. But this was also the height of the industrial era, and with that came all the slums and the underclass created with that. So what Dickens shows in the novel is the ways in which the charging through of the trains actually revealed often to the eye what had been concealed to many of the middle class before, the appalling conditions of the slums that were on the outskirts or in the centre of the cities. So what happened with the coming of the railways is that you've got a complete change in your sense of time and space. Because if you imagine before the railways, people would take many days to travel from town to town. You didn't have any standardised time, so it was known as the coming of railway time, as all of the towns had to now synchronise their clocks. And with it came then, and with the factories as well, a sense of time being organised not by nature and natural rhythms, but by the determination of the engine, whether it's in the factory or on the railway line. So changing sense then of the time and also of space. The fact that everybody can now get to London should they wish, and indeed in the Great Exhibition of 1851, people travel often for the first time the length and breadth of England, and a sense that now you can move in ways that had not been thought possible. But with that also came a sense of a question of what it is to be human, now that so many parameters had changed. Now, Dombey and Son is a crusading novel. It wants to transform things, but it's also very funny. And for those of you who were brought up on the BBC Sunday serials, you'll probably remember that they were all incredibly dark. Certainly I was completely put off Dickens when I was young, because all it seemed to be was this action going up in flames in a window, with dark interiors, and no sense of the comedy. So I thought I'd start, I have to be careful here, by reading you the opening of the novel, just to give you a sense of how Dickens set the scene. Dombey sat in the corner of the darkened room, in the great armchair beside the bedside, and Son lay tucked up warm in a little basket bedstead, carefully disposed on the low settee, immediately in front of the fire, and close to it, as if his constitution were analogous to that of a muffin, and it was essential to toast him brown while he was very new. Dombey was about 8 and 40 years of age. Son, about 8 and 40 minutes. Dombey was rather old, rather red, and though handsome, well-made man, too stern and pompous in appearance to be prepossessing. Son was very old and very red, and though of course an undeniably fine infant, somewhat crushed and spotted in his general effect as yet. So I've got this wonderful sense of the analogy between these two red and bald figures. Dombey, 48, sorry, think time was that. Dombey, 48 years, and his son 48 minutes. And there's this preoccupation with time that goes through. But I'll read you another section, now talking about the ways in which Dombey conceived of his firm. Dombey and Son. Those three words conveyed the one idea of Mr. Dombey's life. The earth was made for Dombey and Son to trade in, and the sun and the moon were made to give them light. Rivers and seas were formed to float their ships. Rainbows gave them promise of fair weather. Winds blew for or against their enterprises. Stars and planets circled in their orbits to preserve inviolate a system of which they were the centre. Common abbreviations took new meaning in their eyes and had sole reference to them. AD had no concern with Anno Domini, but stood for Anno Dombey and Son. So what you've got here is a complete rewriting by Dombey the merchant of the whole religious eschatology, in the sense that time and Anno Domini relates only to himself and his son. The reworking, obviously, of God the Father and God the Son. Now, as I've suggested, this links with a complete obsession in the novel with the sense of control of time, trying to depict the ways in which the Victorians became preoccupied by this control. Within the novel, there are two children, Paul, who seemed just being born, and also his older sister Florence, who is 6. As a girl, she's been regarded as worthless by her father. As he says, it meant a base coin that couldn't be invested or add to the capital of the house's name and dignity. It was a wonderful representation of the way in which Dombey is so focused on his son, just cannot almost see his daughter, and when he sees her, he's disturbed by her. Both Paul and Florence are children deprived of childhood, forced into premature development. Paul by excessive maternal expectations, and Florence, conversely, by paternal neglect. Paul's sufferings are not primarily physical, as with many children in the Victorian age, but mental, as the weight of Dombey's expectations distorts his psychological growth. Dombey just cannot wait for Paul to grow up. His dominant feeling, which intensifies with time, is just utter impatience. His heart, insofar as it's capable of taking any impression, one might say, as an image of his son, though not so much as an infant or as a boy, but as a grown man, the son of the firm. And it's with this imaginary adult that Dombey spends his time in constant communication in his thoughts. Dombey is torn. Believing himself to love his son, he cannot reconcile the alter ego who figures in these self-communions with the child placed before him. He wishes, Dickens says, to buy off Paul from childhood. And as the villain of Peace Carker later observes, Dombey and son know neither time nor place nor season, but bear them all down. So the imperialist and capitalist enterprise, which is the firm, annihilates all natural distinctions of space and time. Just translated into domestic policy, this attitude produces a yearning for a child who is not a child. The non-productive season of youth can be skipped or accelerated. Now, in one way, Dombey gains his desire. Paul is what Dickens describes as an old-fashioned child. And he has his strange, old-fashioned, thoughtful way. With his precocious moods, he's like one of those terrible little beings in the fairy tales, who at 150 or 200 years of age fantastically represent the children for whom they've been substituted. So we're going back to those wonderful fairy tales where you could get the changelings and your child being substituted. In keeping with the malign literalism of so many fairy tale wishes, Dombey has indeed been granted his wish, a child who is also an adult. The fairy tale changeling prefigures in mockingly grotesque form the domestic fantasies of this capitalist patriarch. Paul's replication of his father, so comically depicted at birth, is continued into his childhood. Thus we have another scene where both of them are sitting by the fire. Paul with his old face, both with wandering thoughts. Mr. Dombey, stiff with starch and arrogance, the little image by inheritance and in unconscious imitation, the two so very much alike, and yet so monstrously contrasted. So a sense here of what is happening to little Paul. Is he being just pressed into the mould, this unconscious imitation? And the horror of this monstrous likeness between the two. Is it that Paul, overburdened by all these pressures, biological inheritance, unconscious imitation, and parental expectation, actually appears older than his father? Dickens depicts a wonderful conversation between the two, where Paul asks his father about the value of money. It's one of those moments in Dickens that he always has, where the child asks in all innocence a question that the adult then has to answer. It's rather like Wordsworth in his poetry, where he has in the lyrical ballads, and We Are Seven, if you know it, and others, where you get a child questioning the wisdom of the adult. But Paul is not an incarnation of the pure wisdom of innocent childhood living in harmony with nature, but rather a distinctly social and unnatural product of his environment. In his creation of this old-fashioned child, Dickens drew together a variety of strands from contemporary culture. So you've got echoes of the Wordsworthian child of We Are Seven, or of the child from the evangelical tracts, who was too good for this world and so destined for an early death. You probably know there's an endless religious verse and stories about these wonderfully good children who they often frequently rejoiced were taken to God in early years. So he belongs to that sort of genre. But he's also directly engaging with educational psychological debates about child development, which stretch back to Rousseau in the 18th century. At the time of writing Dombey and Son, Dickens was deeply preoccupied with questions of education. He recently toured around England looking at various educational establishments, so he could decide where to place his own son, Charlie. And on the return, he was travelling to Switzerland. He wrote to Lord Morpeth just a week before he started Dombey and Son, indicating his desire for a commissionaireship or inspectorship on any questions connected with the education of the people, the elevation of their character, the improvement of their dwellings, their greater protection against disease and vice, or with the treatment of criminals, or the administration of prison discipline. Rather a right remit he was suggesting. He was also in correspondence with Lord John Russell, and indeed before leaving had proposed to the educationist James K. Shuttleworth that they should set up a ragged school themselves. One, Dickens says, where the boys would not be wearied to death and driven away by long pulpit discourses. And whilst he was in Switzerland, which is where he was writing Dombey and Son, he repeatedly praised the Swiss schools, and he visited a blind institution where he was fascinated, as he had been when he visited a similar institution in Boston, by the progress made in teaching blind, deaf and dumb to speak. So he's quite fascinated by what he thought was the potential locked away in children and the techniques that were being developed at that time for enabling those who were previously being just shut away in silence and ignored to be brought into their full potential. In Dombey and Son, Dickens creates 3 different forms of education establishments. There's Pynchon's, where Paul goes first, then Dr. Blimber's, and then also the charitable grinders, where another figure I won't look too much at, Robin Toogood is best. Now, while Mrs. Pipchin's infantine boarding house is not strictly a school, Paul is to be sent there for what is termed bodily and mental training. And Mrs. Pipchin herself is held to be quite scientific in her knowledge of the childish character. She's known as a woman of system with children. Now, this is the first time in Dickens' writing that he actually bases any events in the novels on his own life. And so Mrs. Pipchin is based upon Mrs. Roylance, with whom he lodged whilst he was working in the blacking factory. You probably know one of the most sort of important facts about Dickens' life is that when he was young, his father had withdrawn him from school and placed him in a blacking factory. And so not only was there sort of the horrors of working in a factory, but also the sense of social disgrace he felt for being removed from his middle-class environment. And so through his life, he does keep reworking these experiences. But this is the first time he does it. So Mrs. Roylance, who's described as an ogress and a child queller. So she carries the weight of Dickens' own emotions, linking the sufferings of her fairly well-off inmates with that of a terrified child who'd been cast down from middle-class to working-class status. And Mrs. Pipchin's designed scientific system of child management links her with the world of mechanisation. Dickens says it was a part of her system not to encourage a child's mind to develop and expand itself like a young flower, but to own it by force like an oyster. There's a wonderful image of the knife coming up and splitting the child apart. The idea of following nature in child development goes back to Rousseau, although the specific image of the mind as a flower was even more closely identified with Friedrich Freud, the founder of the kindergarten movement. And although the first kindergarten was not to open in England until 1851, and Dickens was very supportive of it, he possibly came across the Froebelian ideas whilst in Switzerland, because there were various schools opened there in the 1830s. Now, this violence of the image of the oyster, forced open by a metallic instrument in order to be devoured, is a fitting introduction to an establishment which is described as having a sterile garden, and snails adorning the doors like cupping glasses, as if the inmates are going to be drained of their life's blood. Mrs. Pipchin's system is, Dickens says, to oppose nature at every point. So children are frequently sent to bed at 10 o'clock in the morning, and are given everything they didn't like and nothing that they did. And Dr. Blimber's hothouse is anticipated in Mrs. Pipchin's very menacing collection of plants. She has these unseasonal cacti, which are described as writhing like hairy serpents, or hanging from the ceiling as if boiled over. Now, in keeping with her systematic thwarting of all natural childhood impulses, Mrs. Pipchin strongly approves of Mr. Dombey's decision to place the 6-year-old Paul at Dr. Blimber's, where he can commence his studies in Greek. There is, she observes, a great deal of nonsense, and worse, talked about young people not being pressed too hard at first. Now, this nonsense dates back to Rousseau, who you probably knows, had talked about natural education, and he actually suggested that children should not be introduced to books until they were 15, which is rather extreme, one might think, the sense that they have to naturally develop. From that, you get the sense of you should not give children books too soon. But although these ideas were taken up, they didn't seem to do much to change the ways in which middle classes were being educated. One of the most famous cases in this line is John Stuart Mill, who writes in his autobiography about how he started learning Greek from the age of 3. That was somewhat extraordinary, but nonetheless, they were trying to get children from the earliest of age, before we'd even get them to start reading, to learn Latin and Greek, in a sense that you didn't have time and you had to ensure that they were galloping through their childhood. Now, advice and psychiatric literature in the beginning of the century had carried warnings about the effects of parental pressure on children's education. There's this book, William Buchan's Advice to Mothers, 1809, which many homes would have had two contrasting examples of the malign effects of bad parenting. Thus, a young man, Neddy, who'd been so cosseted and protected that at 18 he looked aged 80 and had died at 21. And then there was the case of Isabella Wilson, whose fond mother had proudly nurtured her intellectual development, which at 14 had surpassed all of the others, only for her then to fall into fits and then revert to childhood. So there's a real sort of sense that what parents were doing were forcing their children. And there's some very wonderful comic descriptions of parents rejoicing when their child died of overeducation and putting up their memorial tablets in the churchyard. So psychiatric texts noted that overstrained and premature exercise of intellectual powers could lead to insanity, while a Cyclopedia of Practical Medicine speaks of the errors in education consigning the sufferer to an early grave. But interestingly, these various references are not developed, and they're more a registration, I think, of popular social belief than a key platform of argument. And interestingly, it is actually in Dickens that you find the first really developed study of overpressure, and this was to pass quickly into medical literature as a founding case study, which I think is quite a strange notion for us now, that actually a case study would be drawn from literature, but this was indeed the case. After Dickens published Dombey and Son, you find a case of little Paul Dombey being taken up in a whole range of medical texts. Right through I found it being quoted as the founding study until the 1920s. So Paul is to be placed at Dr. Blimber's both to further his education so that he can take his rightful place in the firmament, and also to wean him from his sister, as he was very emotionally attached to Florence. Blimber, making a man of Paul, is to isolate him from the feminine domain of warmth and emotion associated with Florence, and to catapult him into adulthood. Thus, Paul forlornly replies, "I'd rather be a child." Dr. Blimber's establishment is described famously as a great hothouse in which there was a forcing apparatus incessantly at work. All the boys bloomed before their time. Then green peas were produced at Christmas, and intellectual asparagus all the year round. Nature was of no consequence at all. Now Dickens points out the horticultural market and disadvantages of such a mode of production, for it was not the right taste about the premature productions, and they didn't keep well. The image of education is that the forced production of fruit is to be found in Rousseau's Emile. Nature would have the children before they are men. If we try to invert this order, we shall produce a forced fruit, immature and flavourless, fruit which will be rotten before it is ripe. We shall have young doctors and old children. The foundations of that old-fashioned child Paul and Dr. Blimber's hothouse of education clearly rest with Rousseau. But Dickens has taken the elements and made them his own, turning them into a commentary on the mid-Victorian age. So this hothouse is not merely an aristocratic glasshouse designed to enhance the natural power of sun and produce fruit for the rich man's table. It is dominated by a great forcing apparatus, turning it into a product of the great machine age. The boys are not just flowers which blow before their time, but shrill engines, forced to perform incessantly, without attention to time or season. The text anticipates hard times in the parallels it draws between the grandery of utilitarian education and the ceaseless workings of what Dickens, describing machines, called the melancholy mad elephants of the industrial machines which dominate Cape Town life. And this transformation of organic flowering into mechanised blowing receives its apotheosis in the figure of Mr. Toots, very comically named, whose very name instantly connects him with the railway networks. He possesses the gruffest of voices and the shrillest of minds. Having gone through everything, he suddenly left off blowing one day and remained in the establishment a mere stalk. And people did say that the doctors had rather overdone it with young Toots, and that when he began to have whiskers, he left off having brains. So you've got this wonderful sense that Toots comes as a normal infant, develops all this wisdom, and then loses his brains. In fact, he remains a very amiable idiot throughout the novel. So in Dickens' hands, Dr. Blimber's hothouse becomes the condensed expression of the overflow of the natural laws of space-time development in the new mechanised and imperial age. Interestingly, it's not Dr. Blimber, the headmaster himself, who's seen as a particularly malign figure. He's not a sadistic bully like Squeers in Nicholas Nickleby and Dotheboys Hall, or Creakle in David Copperfield at Salem House. And corporal punishment does not seem to figure in the school. Rather, Dr. Blimber imposes on school life the relentless attitude to time to be found in the wider culture. As his daughter remarks to Paul, "Don't lose time, Dombey, for you have none to spare." Now this seemingly innocent comment holds for the reader a darker meaning, offering an unwitting prophecy of Paul's death. Dr. Blimber is incapable of registering the fact that his young gentlemen are children. He regards them as if they were all doctors who were born and grown up. And his forcing system, with its constant pressures at work, provides a frantic dash through the rewritten ages of man, so that pupils have all the cares of the world after they've been in the school for 3 months and wish to be buried in the earth by 6. Now Dickens places the blame for this wanton destruction of childhood not on Blimber, but on the parents, who urge him on by their blind vanity and ill-considered haste. There's Dombey, on learning that Paul was naturally clever, was more bent than ever on him being forced and crammed, while Briggs's father, on hearing conversely that his son wasn't gifted, was still inexorable on the same purpose. In short, however high and false the temperature at which the doctor kept his hothouse, the owners of the plant, like the parents, were always ready to lend a helping hand at the bellows and to stir the fire. So Dombey, in his pride of ownership in his son, is replicated in the other parents, who, in mimicry of global trading, force their plants into a tropical zone in order to intensify their productivity. And the baneful effect of colonial life has already been felt by Master Livingstone, whose temper had been made vengeful by the solar heat of India acting on his blood. But the full negative effects of colonial overheating are to be found in a hideously overripe specimen in the novel called the Major. Now he's an adult who is an absolute sort of parasite who attaches himself to Dombey and is forever misguiding his judgment. And he talks about his own experiences of education. So he boasts of his own schoolhood experience at Sandhurst, where you fellows had been roasted, and I wonder whether that links back to the muffin being roasted at the beginning, and then hung out of windows by their boots. And the Major claims it was the making of them. We were iron, sir, and it forged us. So the British educational manufacture of such iron creates the sadism of colonial rule with which the Major is identified. So whilst the pupils of Dr. Blimber's tend to wither or die, the Major becomes a figure of excess. Although he claims that he was forced into such full blow by high hothouse heat in the West Indies that he was known as the flower, which seems most unlikely. But he's identified by Dickens rather with the ripeness or the rottenness of overripe fruit. So always overripe, and by turns described as black or blue, is reduced at one point to nothing but a heaving mass of indigo in his native servant's eyes. Now the Major forms an explicit link between the hothouse of Dr. Blender's and that of colonial rule. In place of the civilizing mission of the white man, leading out by example of the native people, which features so prominently in the imperial ideology of the time, we're offered an image of a thoroughly degraded and corrupt being whose brutalizing of others is reflected in his own transformation into a formless mass, an embodiment of that key colonial product, indigo, which was itself identified with the colour of the natives. Now, although it was Dickens as an enlightened critic of racism, there are all sorts of problems in Dickens' politics, and you can't say that he was out there campaigning against imperial policies all the time. But he does show, through the degraded figure of the Major with his imperial complexion, how unfitted such overripe beings were for colonial rule. The Major's sustained torment of his servant, which is simply called the Native, had no particular name but answered to any vituperative epithet, is a disturbing image of the consequences enacted when the selfish egotism nurtured by British middle-class culture is exported overseas. And the Major's relation with the Native, who is frequently cursed and beaten, offers the most negative image of education in the novel. Now, just as the Native is bullied by the Major, so the poor, beleaguered inmates of Dr. Bland's are harassed by their parents. So far from creating exotic flowers, Dr. Blimber's education seems to reduce his pupils to the condition of primeval slime. So they did not break up for a vacation, they simply oozed away. Now, although when they've been at school, the forcing system has been ruining their lives, dominating their unconscious minds, so we learn that Tozer taught Greek and Latin in his sleep, and Briggs was ridden by his lessons as by night. Yet, these children, nonetheless, preferred staying at school to going home. And this was because of the way in which they were treated by their parents when they returned home, always being pressed for more and more examination and study. So Tozer, once home, was to be subject to examination at all times, whilst so severe were the mental trials of Briggs that his friends always expected to see his hat floating in the ornamental pond in Kensington Gardens, and an unfinished exercise lying on the bank. So the projection is undoubtedly comic, but only because of its exceedingly incongruous nature. There's a wonderful image of a hat in the pond. But it anticipates both the first discussions of child suicide in the 1850s and the major debates on educational overpressure which were to follow in the 1880s, where the notion of child suicide through overeducation became a major preoccupation. As I suggested, the ideas in Dombey and Son were taken up almost immediately. One doctor who took up the ideas was someone called Robert Bruton-Alcant, and he produced an absolutely wonderfully entitled essay called On the Artificial Production of Stupidity in Schools, which I think should be reprinted every year. In fact, it was frequently reprinted in the 19th century. It became sort of Bible for those wanting to change the educational system. So Carter supplements Dickens' accounts of brain-forcing in Dr. Blimber's with tales of boys aged only at 10 forced to work at their books until midnight, and young men and women crippled alike in mind and body by the effects of excessive and premature study. Now, little Paul is pressed out of life. He dies while listening to what the waves are saying. So it's the gentle rhythms of nature, the waves, are set against the remorseless time of the steam train and the new industrial age. Now, after the death of Paul, Mr. Dombey, in grief, takes a journey across England. Just a brief snippet of this wonderful depiction of charging across. Louder and louder, yet it shrieks and cries as it comes tearing on, resistless to the groan. And yet now its way, still like the way of death, is strewn with ashes thickly. Everything around is blackened. There are dark pools of water, muddy lanes, and miserable habitations far below. There are jagged walls and fallen houses close at hand, and through the battered roofs and broken windows, wretched rooms are seen. where want and fever hide themselves in many wretched shapes, while smoke, crowded gables and distorted chimneys, and deformity of brick and mortar, penning up deformity of mind and body, choke the murky distance. There's a sense that in this train line, what he's seeing is what is happening to England within the industrial economy. And this deformity of brick and mortar, the horrible slums that have been thrown up, are actually both hiding and creating a deformity of mind and body. So we see then a deformity also that's being shown to us. It's the victims of industrial culture, but it's also Dombey himself, in his pride, locked in his ideas he cannot escape, unable to cope with the grief when he has lost his son. There is education throughout this novel. Dickens, as I said, was crusading, trying to educate his readers, but also we find this education of all the protagonists, or the ones that come out on the side of good. Dickens has often been associated with caricature, but reading the novel you'll find there are extraordinarily subtle psychological portrayals in relation to Dombey and his despised daughter Florence. You see the way in which the hatred of his daughter develops and the jealousy of her, first because Paul had preferred his sister to him, and then later on when he thinks that she sides with his new wife against him. In wonderfully subtle ways in which you can see the poisonous familiar relations developing in this household. With the introduction of his new wife Edith, who is a figure who also is a child, or a woman who never had a childhood. She was forced to grow up prematurely, but for her the form of prematurity was that she's hawked around all the watering places in England by her mother, who's determined to enforce a good marriage for her. And in fact, she's virtually sold to Dombey. She despises and hates her position. So, as you can imagine and hear and tell, there's a wonderfully melodramatic plot. We get Edith fleeing from Dombey, the villain of the piece who's torn to pieces by a train, and Dombey and Son, of course, as a firm, falls. But this being Dickens, the work of real moral education takes place. Dombey learns to value his despised daughter Florence. And inevitably, we have sentimentality here, quite uncomfortable and trading Dickens, but very hard-telling nonetheless. And within it, there is nonetheless, I think, real subtlety of analysis. One problem I think we find if you read is the representation of Florence. Dickens is able to describe wonderfully the way in which she sustains constantly all these slights and hurts. But Dickens is famously unable to come to terms with female sexuality. So you'll find that Florence becomes a woman, but she's still also a child. Dickens cannot make her into a fully fledged sexual being. And Edith Dombey, who is certainly a sexual being, is pitted that she has to be removed from the scene. You cannot have her cluttering up the end. But Florence is always a child and a woman, an innocent figure who, despite all her travails, maintains her innocence. She finds friends and future husband in an alternate world of childlike adults who preserve the innocence and values of the previous age. So it's not the harsh mechanistic time of industrial age, but she turns to the rhythms of the sea, to sailors, and to old Sol Gills, who's a nautical instrument maker. So throughout Dickens' novels, there's a sense of anger as to how society was treating its young. The brutalities, both mental and physical, that were visited upon these poor innocent children. In the case of Paul Dombey, as I suggested, he passed directly into the medical textbooks and became the focus of a campaign for over 70 years to change the nature of education. Writing in the 1860s, a leading medical figure described Dickens as the most influential figure of the age. And although we must allow for some exaggeration here, the statement does capture the extraordinary impact Dickens had on Victorian society and culture, with a legacy, as we can see, which continues into our own age. Sorry,
I think it's fair to say that Dombey sounds like a growing up novel in which all the characters learn to grow young. And at the end, you always see this sort of second childhood for everybody, with the nautical thing.
yes, yes. It's how you get innocence that isn't simply linked with childhood. And all the characters that he becomes connected to have levels of childhood within them. Yeah, so there's a romanticisation, I think, clearly there. Oh, it's very positive, yes, yes. But it's also to think that Florence had gone through all those experiences and remained completely unbesmirched, I think is unlikely. Also, when Dombey was dealing with her future husband Walter, he changed his mind. He was going to have him fall from grace, and then decided it wouldn't quite fit the moral plot of the novel, so changed it so that he remained a cleaner character. Yes?
Could you tell us something about how Dickens himself brought up his own children and how he dealt with their education?
This is not a happy tale. He initially, because he had quite a few children, and he was initially, as you see, sort of touring around England where to place Charlie. But I think he lost, well, he had marital difficulties, as you probably know, and he seemed to lose interest in his children, was somewhat at a distance from them. And when they were a teenage, he was very keen to send them off abroad. Many of them went down, because he was sending them off to South Africa. Pardon?
It's all rather ironically in a way.
It is, yes, yes. No, it's very startling when you start looking at what happened to the children of the great Victorian novelists. Because it was the dumb thing to send your kids off to the colonies. But the numbers who died is really quite perturbing. If I'd been a parent, of course, well, one doesn't know. But he did not have that close engagement that he would hope.
So don't you think, though, that part of the anxiety children had was because life expectancy was so much shorter in those days? And that must have had a bearing. I mean, take somebody like Stanford Raffles, who was probably just about contemporary Dickens. But, I mean, he had achieved his great achievement of acquiring Singapore and deal with the Dutch about the time he was 21. And he brought his collection of tropical plants back to Kenya. And he actually lived quite a long time later. But people's careers were much more compacted.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, that you have a sense that because so many of the children died, indeed, of many Victorian novelists, and so a sense that they're both precious, but how long you have them for. So you can see the ways in which the precious were. But then you could also see it operate in another way. Because once they began to have an idea that a child should have a childhood, which really is a very 19th century notion, then you get the ideas of trying to protect the child and to keep it in childhood. And by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, a child has become this incredibly sentimental, the garden where we would all love to go back and join our child. So yes, there's the tension between the sort of pressures and the worry how long they'll be, but also then this emerging idea that children should have a childhood, which we have absolutely now, don't we? It's enshrined in sort of international charters, etc.
Could I ask you whether you could go so far as to say that the hothouse treatment for Sanford not only caused him to not be able to flourish, but actually contributed to his death?
That's absolutely, I think, what Dickens' message is. He's not beaten or anything else, but just the way in which things was raining down upon him. He just sort of gives up and dies. Yeah.
Thank you. What struck me, I'm still at the early stages of reading Dombey and Sanford, But I just imagined the introduction of kindergarten, which was that a Swiss invention?
Yes.
That's one point. The other point is the continuing, and I don't know if this is particularly English or British attitude to the education of girls, because I mean, certainly in the 20th century it was not unusual for all the resources established to educate boys and not girls. And I just wondered whether kindergarten education is much more sexually equal, and would Florence and Paul, if they both intended to say kindergarten at school, had different lives.
Yeah, that's interesting, yes. So kindergartens were introduced, the first one in England was 1851. But the education of the young was surprisingly undifferentiated quite often in middle-class households. And it was not until the boy was sent away to school that you got the real differentiation. And many great men, scientists, etc., talk about the wonders of the education they received at their mother's knee. And that then became sort of an impetus to looking at women's education, always, so they can be better wives and mothers and bring up the sons of England. But interesting, when you get to the 1880s, this idea of over pressure has a very interesting twist, because the doctors started to argue that higher sort of high school education and indeed university education would be very bad for girls, because the argument was that there's a set amount of energy in the body, and if the energy that should go to the reproductive system was going to the brain, then women would not be able to reproduce. And this was argued in America, it was argued here, it was used as an argument to keep women out of Oxford. So very interesting, because although your sympathies wished to be with these people campaigning for the rights of the child and against an over-pressured education, in fact, it had that sort of rather disturbing undercurrent when it came to women.
So, when I was saying would you comment on the engine driver in Dombey and Son, who seems to be one of the most interesting characters?
Yes, Tootle. Yes, because Mr. Tootle, the connection with Dombey is that Mr. Tootle's wife has to leave her children and go and bring up and be a wet nurse to little Paul, whose mother dies after giving birth. And throughout the novel, you get this balance between the unfamiliar Dombey household and the household of the Tootles, where they're all tumbling and no money, but a sense of real warmth, which is interesting because Dickens manages this at the same time as Polly, the mother, actually not being there. So it's just a bit of a sleight of hand. But then you get Mr. Tootles, there's a wonderful scene where he meets Dombey at the railway station and says to him something equivalent to, "I'm sorry for your loss." And Dombey is furious that this man had presumed to think there was anything that could connect the two of them. And this then precedes this nightmare railway drive. But in the end, everything comes right in that one of Mr. Tootle's sons is sent to the charitable grinders as a seeming aspect of philanthropy by Dombey. But in fact, this is another form of horrific. It was sort of mal-education, with the poor boy made to wear this yellow uniform and stoned in the streets as they sort of kicked by the other kids. But at the end, you actually have this boy being rescued because he turns into a bad lot by the nautical side, re-educated. And Mr. Tootles is then educated by his children, and so becomes a perfect model for what should happen. So yes, he's a very interesting character, though again I think there is sentimentality in this notion.
I've written about girls' boarding schools and contributed to psychoanalysts to the boarding school syndrome. And I wondered if, in my day, my 9 years incarceration, we were never taught Dickens, but we had to read Jane Austen. And I wondered if that was, we were supposed to be, the wives of empire. I wonder, in a somewhat sort of telegraph, I wonder if Dickens was seen as too brown, why we women were not allowed to read Dickens, because it did confront class, whereas Austen celebrates it. And is Dickens now on A-level syllabus?
I believe so. Anybody know? But Great Expectations has often served. But that's very interesting, and I can see why, because Dickens he's often treated as low, isn't he? It's not highbrow in the way of other writers, but that might be another way of getting around the class issue, because certainly he was campaigning, and you cannot read a Dickens novel without coming out full of indignation. Yes, so you might have been protected from all that.
It didn't work.
The nature of it is morning when died in the seal. I mean, how big was Dombey's sort of more data if you compare it some way like it came out? And how big was it as a circular thing that was going in the nation? Was it like some big brother or something like that?
Absolutely, it was. My heart breaks when I'm told my teachers only could possibly teach Dickens in school now, because in the 19th century, even those who couldn't read know about the latest Dickens. There's wonderful tales of the way in which the working class areas, the local reader would sit and people would come and listen. And the tales of when the latest installments were reaching New York on the steamer. Crowds of the rocks. There's a sense that sort of right across the culture, people were reading Dickens, and they weren't reading and they were listening either in the local groups or Dickens lecturing, because he went all around the country. In the end, it's believed it killed him, just the sheer physical effort of constantly going around and lecturing. But yes, so I would say Big Brother was quite a good equivalent, apart from its effects.
We've been treated to the most fascinating, breadth and depth of discussion on Dickens and his effect on social history. And, thank you very much indeed, Professor. And I'm sure we're enriched as a consequence of it all.